Being in a calorie deficit doesn't mean that you have to start yourself, okay? We all know that if you wanna build our dream physique, we wanna look good, have low body fats, wanna be shredded, everything starts with losing the fat, losing the excess fat. You're never gonna be able to build your dream physique if you're sitting at 15, 16, more than that in terms of body fat. You need to be close to 10. That is the rule for aesthetic physique. Okay, so in order for you to build your dream physique, you have to go through a phase where you need to shred as much body fat as possible. Okay, and that's why we need to be in the calorie deficit at some point. Not for the rest of your life, of course, but there's certain phases that requires you to be in a calorie deficit to strip off the body fats. Okay, a deficit is required for you to lose the fat. Like you cannot contradict the science. Okay, if you want to lose the fat, you need to be in a deficit. In order for you to be in a calorie deficit, you need to be consuming less calories than what you expend. And of course, we can talk about ways to optimize your calories output. You know, it comes from your BMR, your daily steps, your metabolic activity. All of that can be optimized, sure, but it doesn't remove you from the obligation to control what you put in your stomach. The calories you consume will, at the end of the day, play a significant role in your overall calorie deficit. Are you in a surplus or in deficit? That's always going to come down to what you consume on a daily basis. And that's why you need to bring a lot of awareness to the amount of calories and the macros that you're consuming on a day-to-day basis. Because if you don't control that, you're never going to be able to be in a proper deficit. And you want to be so precise with your tracking that you want to maintain the same consistency over an extended period of time, right? And I feel like for most people, this is where they fucked up. When they go in a calorie deficit, they just focus on eating less food, right? But if you drastically cut your calories, yes, you're gonna be losing some weight, but is it gonna be sustainable? No. This is why when we do a calorie deficit, don't go more than 200, 300, like at max, you will push it to 500 calories and create a deficit, right? But don't go more than that. You always wanna do it gradually. So you start with a slight deficit. When you start your phase, you need to be at maintenance, and then you start reducing your calories slowly, slowly, slowly. Like I rather do it like very slow because it's gonna be more sustainable to the end, right? So being a calorie deficit is required. We all know that. Problem is most people mess up, and what's gonna happen is if you start eating just less food, it's not sustainable. You're gonna start having cravings, hunger will spike, and you end up eating all of your calories during the weekend and restart the cycle again. That's the last thing we want, okay? But that being said, again, we cannot avoid being in a calorie deficit. It is required. You're gonna have to go through a period of time where you have to be consuming less calories. That's the rule, okay? We all been there. I've been there myself. All my clients, they go through this phase. But the problem is, if you're in a calorie deficit and you don't find a way to make it easy, to make it sustainable, most likely you're gonna end up overeating during the weekends. Or maybe one night you're gonna be like, fuck it, I'm gonna go for the cookies. I've been disciplined for 5 days. I feel too much hunger now. I have too much cravings. Fuck it today. It's gonna happen, I know. So you need to find a way where you have to make the calorie deficit sustainable, because what it looks like is, let's say you start at maintenance calorie and you're like 2,500. Then you have to reduce your calories to 2,200. Then eventually to 2,000 calories, okay? Imagine this is your plate at 2,500 calories. Now you fill up with all of this food, right? If you go 2,200 calories, well, of course, there's gonna be less calories. So naturally, people tend to reduce the portion they eat on their plate to be in a calorie deficit. That's what makes sense. Around 2,000 calories, you're gonna be again less food. So the volume is significantly lower on a 2,000 calories intake versus on the 2,500 calories. And this is where the problem is, because I'm gonna move this way actually, because this is your stomach. Picture it as your stomach. When you eat certain food, that takes space in your stomach. And of course, if you wanna be more smart with the food that we eat, we have to be focusing on whole foods. Like I've been saying that all the time on my channel. like we need to prioritize whole foods, right? Because in terms of density, it's going to be more optimal and also facilitate digestion and, you know, give the body the nutrients it actually needs. So we're going to be focusing on whole foods, and we're going to be precise with the fat, protein, and carbs. So when we eat calories, we don't just consume calories, we actually have to break down those calories into macros, right? There's a huge difference between just eating calories and eating your macros. Yes, if you eat the right amount of protein, carbs, and fat, it's gonna give you a specific calorie intake. But we don't focus on calories, we focus on macros, because calories are going to determine your weight, but macros is what will determine the way you look. And that's what we want to focus on when we build a physique. It's just the way we look. So yes, we have to be aware of macros. So you're gonna be eating a certain amount of fat, protein, and carbs on a daily basis, and that's gonna take some space in your stomach, right? Thing is, if you just reduce the food you eat, well, let's start with a deficit. If you are in a deficit, the food will only fill up your stomach, let's say, till this point, okay? And if you have to reduce your calorie intake, because again, we're pushing the fat loss phase, you have to decrease it at some point, and more than once technically, but you have to do it strategically. But let's say you're going from 2,200 to 2,000 calories. Now you reduce the food on your plate, and now you eat like to this way, because you're creating more deficit. But the problem is, we need to address this gap. This gap right there, because there is no food, that's actually why you always feel the need to eat more food. It's because of this gap. It's not only about the calorie deficit, it's more about the gap that is in your stomach. Because there is different sensors in your stomach, and when you're full, that's where actually the stomach will send some signal to your brain and communicate to your brain that we are actually food. You need to close the fucking door right there. But if we don't eat to the point where we actually trigger that signal, we're always gonna have the hunger, and that's the problem with calorie deficit. The good news is you can actually be in a calorie deficit without starving yourself, because all we have to do is to ask ourselves, how can we fill this gap right there without eating more calories? And that is the trick to make fat loss sustainable, okay? You just wanna fill up your stomach. You wanna eat the right amount of calories, but then fill up your stomach with options or certain type of food that is not going to overall increase the amount of calories you eat on a daily basis. And once you master that, once you understand this game, it's done. Fat loss is gonna be so easy, right? So there's two ways we can do it. The first one is filling this gap with what I call 0-calorie foods. Most of them are greens and veggies. So think about carrots, think about arugula, think about bell pepper, think about mushrooms, spinach. Not all veggies I actually like and digest, right? I have to be honest, so you have to do some experiments on yourself and see, okay, which one are easier for you in your stomach, which one you can digest easily, and focus on them. For me, I realized like if I eat too much broccoli, for example, like it doesn't feel right for my stomach. Something that's easy for me is arugula, beetroots, and bell pepper and mushrooms. That's what I like. So I can add that in my plate to create more volume. And even if you go online and you search macros for bell pepper, for example, it's gonna tell you there is certain carbs, okay? But here's the hack. Most of the carbs from veggies, they coming from fibers, right? And when we track any type of food, we don't just track the carbs. We want to track the net carbs. If you take rice, for example, like there is barely any fiber. So most of the carbs you eat, so the net carbs for rice is going to be most likely what you read on the label. But when you eat like things like bell pepper or broccoli and carrots, yes, you're consuming carb, but most of them are fibers. And the net carb is actually the difference between total carbs and fiber. So if all of the carbs you eat from a food is all fibers, well, the net carb is gonna be 0. So when you track your calories, you're basically adding 0 calories because the carbs are net carbs. They most fiber. It doesn't really count. And that's one way that you can actually be using to fill the gap in your stomach without adding extra calories is by having food where the net carbs is 0, and most of them are veggies and grain. So that's the first hack. So also, you can be picturing this way, okay? Imagine this is your plate. Now, let's just use that example. I'm gonna use green for the veggies. Imagine this is the calories you reduce from 2500 to 2200. That takes this space. Well, if you fill the space with veggies and grains, it's gonna be the same volume on your plate. So that's a way for you to create a deficit without starving yourself, is by adding food that almost have no calories, right? The other option is the one I like the most, because you cannot just fill up your plate with veggies. It's a tool, yes, but don't forget, you still have to hit your fat, protein, and carbs intake, right? We don't just want to be eating less calories. We want to be in a deficit while respecting the macros intakes that we have. So another strategy I love to use is food swapping. Okay, what I mean by that is you want to take your current plate at the moment and be like, okay, what are certain foods I can be replacing with options that are low in calories, but I'm not gonna change my protein intake? Because people who just cut the food in their plate, they also tend to remove the protein, and sometimes we have to maintain the protein high because, you know, we're training, we wanna preserve the muscle, we wanna repair the muscle. So you have to be smart about what food you remove from your plates. And for me, I ask myself, okay, this is the protein I have. Is there a way for me to eat the same amount of protein without changing the volume of my food? Because again, it's all about volume, but I'm actually having less calories. So I'm gonna give you an example. If, let's say, your plate is typically, right, there is steak and there is potatoes and there is eggs. Well, maybe, yes, that's the same volume right there. Just give a random example, by the way. And let's say that's about 800 calories, right? But what I can do is actually using the same plate, but use pumpkin, right? Pumpkin is a good substitute for potatoes. It's gonna take the same volume on your plate, but you're gonna have less carbs, okay? So I can have pumpkins. Instead of having steak, I can have maybe tuna. Even I can have like chicken breast, okay? Same volume, there's gonna be less fat, so less calories, but same protein intake. Sometimes even higher, actually. And instead of having 5 eggs, for example, I'm gonna do 3 eggs, or like 2 eggs plus 3 egg whites. That's the best, and you can fill the gap always with veggies. Okay, so some swaps you can consider is switching from potatoes to pumpkin, switching from eggs to egg white. So if you're typically having 4 eggs for breakfast, well, do 2 eggs and 2 egg whites. Same volume on your plate, same protein, less calories because you're taking off the fats. Instead of having steak, you can have white fish. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of red meat. No, I'm still eat a lot of red meat, but when you go, for example, for the butcher and get ground beef, don't get 85% lean ground beef, get 96% ground beef. Don't just eat steak all the time. Maybe you can do half steak, half seafood. I love to do it, right? So think about ways to add the same volume, but reducing your calories. And this is what this video is about. It's so fucking easy, guys, right? Don't forget that being in a calorie deficit doesn't mean eating less food. It just means eating less calories. Those 2 techniques will completely make your fat loss journey way more sustainable, right? And let's fucking go.